Well, I've actually always drawn ever since, as long as I can remember, ever since I was about 5. I used to fill up kind of big A3 sketch pads, but I think I sort of got interested in sort of art with a capital A, I suppose, when I first visited Barcelona when I was about, must have been about 13 or 14, and visited the Picasso Museum and saw, it was quite amazing. I think one of the things that was most amazing about it was maybe being able to see another artist working and seeing Picasso's work from when he was the same age that I was. And then I started making paintings in my teens, and I had a show in Ipswich. I sort of self-organised a show when I was about 16 or something, and got people to come and made flyers for it. And it was also kind of being in Ipswich as well. There was also kind of like this feeling, I was kind of on the punk scene, and I was in a band and stuff like that, and I knew lots of people that were interested in the kind of like DIY way of doing things. And so that was also a kind of affirmation that anything was possible. So I felt like if people were organising their own gigs and recording their music, why couldn't I do art, you know? There was a foundation course in Ipswich, although it seemed to cater more towards people that were wanting to go into illustration, graphic design, fashion design, things like that. And there was a foundation in fine art at Byamshore School of Art. And my parents, very generously and sort of quite painstakingly sort of put up the money for me to go to study at Byamshore to do foundation for a year, which is where I did fine art. And that's where I started oil painting, because before that I was only ever working in acrylic. And I did things like etching at Byamshore, made like a series of sort of anatomical etchings there, and started looking at contemporary art, started reading a lot more, kind of completely opened out. And then from there I got into the Slade. I was really lucky to get into the Slade School of Art, where I did a 4-year degree, BA. And also when I was at the Slade, I did an exchange at New York Studio School. So I went to New York for 4 months and lived there and studied there, which was amazing. And then I had a couple of years out of the Slade after I left, and then I did the Royal Drawing School. And I met loads of people on that course who have kind of stayed friends and who are also really committed artists. In 2018, I won this award called the Richard Ford Award, which was like, it's basically a grant to go to the Prado Museum to study for 3 months. And I had money to go to Madrid. So when I was there, it was just like a full-time job, drawing every day. And I also had permission to draw in the galleries and access the archives. So I was looking at, I was mostly looking at Goya and looking at Goya's drawings, spending time with Goya's drawings there, sort of copying them, and kind of also drawing in the galleries. I did. Because I was working there so much, I think I did really get immersed in that kind of painting tradition. So I was looking a lot at Jose de Rivera, Velázquez, Goya, but earlier stuff, people like that kind of use this kind of intense contrast between light and dark. They all kind of come out of Caravaggio and Caravaggi's painting, really. A sort of recent trend in my work has been towards that, really. I suppose what initially attracted me to Goya was the kind of the sort of tension between him being an illustrator and a fine artist, and him being a sort of war reporter and making these comments about war and conflict and man's barbarity to man, and also looking at society and kind of putting a mirror up to society, and sometimes being a kind of satirist, and making these quite harsh jokes about human nature, and how the way people treat each other, and then also looking at the kind of side of him that's like a sort of gothic fantasist almost, where he'll have kind of like winged creatures and Frankenstein kind of these kind of invented crazy things. And I think so looking at him probably was the most important part of that trip. But yeah, I spent 3 months there drawing in the Prado, and then found a job working there as an English teacher in a primary school. So I ended up doing quite a lot of work as an artist in the primary school as well, doing a mural for the school about the theme of Europe. Yeah, and that's where I still am now. I wrote my dissertation about folk art, and I think there's still in my work this kind of thing where I'm interested in modernism, but I'm also maybe interested in how modernism has been influenced by some of those kind of like more vernacular or folky art forms. I've always kind of had this sort of DIY approach to painting, where paintings might be for people's houses, and they might be for people's houses that I know. They're not sort of like these big paintings that are designed for lobbies or something. They're very much like there's very much a kind of like intimacy there that is, I suppose I kind of grew up sort of believing that there should be like an artist on every block, and that it should be something that was kind of democratized. And so I always felt like my work, the context for my work was a kind of local context. I've always felt like a local artist in a way. I draw from observation, I draw from imagination, from a composite of all of them. Sometimes I draw from photographs, sometimes I just invent things. I think it kind of has to do with what I'm doing. So for example, when I was working on the Cock Tavern paintings, it was much more, I always think that it was much more of an objective project, because it was about observing these specific people. So often I would do drawings of them in situ. So I would just say to one of them, is it okay if I do your portrait? And they would say, yeah. Maybe I'd buy them a drink or whatever, and we'd sit there for 20 minutes and I would sketch a portrait of them, and then I'd take it back to the studio and work. And that's something that I've been doing this year as well. I'm making a series of painted observational portraits of friends who've just come to sit for me for a few hours at a time, and I've just painted them almost just as an exercise, just to kind of keep my hand and eye working together well, sort of thing. Because I think it does help to observe. I think it does kind of help with the way that you control your eye and your hand, basically, if you're practicing observational work on a regular basis. So there's that, but then these paintings are very much made from after making lots of memory drawings. So I would go on walks around London, and they're very much about people watching. So I would kind of walk around London, spot these characters, and then draw them. Sometimes draw them partly from observation and memory, i.e. them moving down the street and me trying to capture them really quickly, like something about them, their body language, their facial expression, what they're wearing. I remember when I started this painting, I had a drawing of this guy holding a sign, who was initially supposed to be like a homeless guy holding a sign, like a beggar, basically. And what I wanted was this kind of play of his hands over the top of the white sign kind of thing. And I had this little sketch, and that was the idea for it. And I think I maybe had 2 or 3 figures in the drawing, which I started with, and then the rest of it was kind of improvised. So I can remember, when I work, I use this paint called Stokes paint, which is from a builder's merchants in Leeds, and it's kind of like this very thick paint that comes in sort of 3-litre tins. And I can remember kind of mixing up all the paint, but I was quite rushed that day, and I think there was somebody I think I had some kind of pressing email that I needed to reply to or something, and I was kind of like manoeuvring around in the studio trying to get it done. And I think I'd maybe had 3 attempts or so at paintings underneath it, and today was kind of like the day that I had to get it done, and I did, and I managed to do it, and I managed to pull it off. And I can remember sort of starting here and working down here, and then I think I was even on the phone while I was doing this bit. And it's kind of interesting sometimes when you don't even when you're not even thinking about what you're doing, sometimes you do it with more confidence. Or I'm always quite amazed by the drawings that I make whilst I'm on the phone. I kind of have this weird energy that just sort of comes out of me because I'm not second guessing myself, and because I'm disconnected from that sort of overly critical part of my brain. Since I've been here at Asylum Studios, I've just been framing the paintings and getting ready for the show in that way. So I've built quite a lot of the frames for the paintings myself. And then the other thing I've been doing is making these assemblages. They're the first sculptures that I've ever really shown. I've been working with drawing and painting for years and only really shown them. And I think it's quite interesting because rather than having to push yourself, I think I always gravitate towards doing kind of scenes with lots of groups of people and kind of bustling scenes, and that's kind of something that I go towards in my painting. Whereas I think when you're doing sculpture, you kind of have to work within the limitations of sculpture, and there aren't many sculptures that I can think of that have hundreds of people in them, like a Lowry painting or a Bruegel painting would have. So you're kind of working with almost this format that's kind of by default monumental. It's about one figure or it's about one head. So I ended up making a series of heads, and that's what felt most right. I painted them kind of layer upon layer and just playing around trying to adjust the colours to one another really so that they fitted. And I think they have a kind of collaged quality that is inherent in some of the paintings as well, where there's a kind of brutal sort of cropping that goes on between different things, and maybe that there are these clashes between different languages or different characters maybe that happen in them. This is a painting called Bad Town, which I made in London a couple of years ago. Again, it's kind of painted straight from a drawing that I'd done, and I think particularly this one I was quite sort of energised when I can remember around the time that I made this painting I was quite sort of full of energy, and I was like cycling around everywhere doing loads of things, and I can remember kind of doing it in doing it with quite a lot of conviction, and doing it fast, executing it fast. And it's just this kind of jangle of figures really that kind of goes to make up a street scene. And I think originally I had the idea that this would be broken glass, but they ended up just becoming pictorial devices to kind of make up this pattern of sort of dancing figures on the canvas. This is a painting called UKG Party, which stands for UK Garage. I just ended up listening to a lot of it because I kind of wanted to encapsulate London, and I think it's just one of those classic kind of musical genres that just seems to like totally embody London. I just did it from a photograph. It's not even a photograph that I took actually. It's just a photograph that I found online of these kind of revelers at a club, and it's completely different from the photograph. It just evolved. I think I started using the photograph for about the first half of the painting, and then it became no longer important. I suppose I was kind of thinking about, there are some paintings, like there's a painting by Bosch called The Temptation of St. Anthony, and there's another one of Christ carrying the cross, where Christ is kind of pictured his face, and then there are all of these other kind of faces around him, and it's basically a picture of a crowd, but all you really see is their faces, and there's this kind of black background. And I think that I think maybe that was a springboard for this painting, but it was very much about arranging this group of figures in a kind of, so maybe it feeling like a dance floor or the smoking section of a club, and this kind of bustle, and some of them you know better than others, some of them feel more intimate and some of them are peripheral. It just grew really. It's one of the biggest paintings I made in that studio, and it's very much a kind of process of building up and scraping away and putting in characters that didn't work, and then scraping it off and putting other characters in. And often they ended up being quite improvised. They're sort of loosely based on some of the characters that are in that photo, although there's a complete departure from it. And I think using colour in this painting as well was kind of, maybe it was one of the first paintings I'd done that really departed from sort of objective colour or local colour, and it's kind of more to do with, you know, how the shape of this person's face is formed by a kind of dark sort of Indian red and then a light pink. That's the kind of thing that I wasn't ever really doing before, and I suddenly realised that actually I could construct these paintings using any colours really, rather than having to stick to the colour of that thing on the surface, the actual local colour of it, and trying to think about how those colours fit together like a jigsaw puzzle across the whole composition. So I had a job at a market stall in Covent Garden in the piazza, and it was my job to get there early in the morning and cut up the onions and the peppers for the paella which we were selling. It was a paella stall. So you get there at 6 o'clock in the morning, smash up all these onions and put them in a big Tupperware ready for the rest of the day. And then when the market came to life later on in the morning at about 10 or 11, it was just like this bustling, crazy kind of market, you know, like it would have been for probably, like it has been for 300-400 years, Covent Garden Market. And it was just a perfect opportunity to people watch, really, and you would see all kinds of things happening, altercations, couples, children with their parents. You can remember these kind of street performers as well that always used to perform there. There was this guy who used to call himself Showtime, and he had the word Showtime tattooed on his back, and he was a contortionist, and he used to have a tennis racket with all of the strings cut out of it, and he used to be able to fit his whole body through the tennis racket. And I can remember sort of drawing him a couple of times. I saw him outside Camden Market as well. And so things like that, just literally just those kind of like quotidian, everyday things that you see when you step outside your front door, I suppose they, for me, are the kind of material that work gets made from. And it's also kind of the most important thing, because it's the most real experience, it's the most true thing, you know, what happens immediately when you step outside your front door. The other thing that I think that I should mention is this kind of process of drawing that has to do with humour. And I think, like, I've always kind of wanted my work, I suppose, to have a sense of humour in it, because I've always felt like humour is a kind of appropriate response to the world. Sometimes, you know, the kind of ridiculousness of the world, the tragicomedy of the world. And I suppose it's only when you look out at things that you get these kind of spontaneous moments that you couldn't possibly make up, that are funny, that are these kind of crazy clashes between things. And when you, as soon as you look out at the world, you get these kind of arbitrary clashes, I find, that are kind of hilarious and ridiculous, and it's worth trying to get that into the work. And so that's partly why I draw, really, is to be surprised and to find new subject matter, and to like, I think looking at the world is a much more fertile source of invention than my own head is, really. I kind of do go through life looking at the world with this kind of longing, I suppose, and this kind of weird sort of distance, like a kind of voyeur, where I'm kind of like looking upon the world as if it's acting out before me like a play. And I think that's one of the things that kind of makes me do it, essentially. And there's a kind of empathy there's a kind of history of empathy, really, that kind of starts with painters like Velázquez or Goya, where you have a kind of objectivity, but there's also a kind of empathy and understanding or dignity or something to the subject matter that's come about through a kind of real encounter with that subject matter that gets carried through in expressionism as well as objective art. And I think you have to be able to understand people's body language, people's facial expressions, and you have to be able to feel them essentially in order to draw them.